Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. Aurora had spent 8 years guiding hikes through the North Cascades. She knew every mile of the Cascade Pass Trail, every sharp bend, every overlook where tourists stopped to catch their breath and photograph the jagged mountain peaks. The Douglas firs and western red cedars lining the path were like old acquaintances to her. Their massive trunks and spreading branches felt as familiar as the rooms of her own home. She had guided families with small children, older couples celebrating anniversaries, and solitary adventurers seeking silence and isolation in nature. Throughout all those years, in every season and under every kind of weather, she had never experienced anything that made her question her confidence in those mountains. That was about to change in a way she never could have imagined. It all began with an email in late October, when the tourist season was already beginning to fade and the first snows were starting to lightly cover the higher areas. A man named Nicholas contacted Aurora through the website for her guiding service. He wanted to hire her for a private hike to a remote alpine meadow near Cascade Pass, a place he had seen in old photographs from the 1970s. He offered her twice her usual rate and emphasized that he needed to reach that specific point before the winter snowfall made it inaccessible. Something about the urgency of his message made Aurora hesitate for a moment. However, the pay was good, and she took pride in being able to adapt to her client's requests. She agreed to meet him at the Cascade River Road trailhead at dawn 3 days later. Nicholas arrived exactly at the agreed time, driving a rental car with Oregon plates. He appeared to be in his 40s and seemed fit enough for the hike, but there was a nervous energy about him that made Aurora uncomfortable. As they prepared their backpacks, he kept looking over his shoulder, watching the empty parking lot as if he expected someone else to appear. When Aurora asked him whether he was waiting for other hiking companions, he quickly shook his head and said they had to begin immediately. The sun had barely started to stain the eastern sky with pale orange light when they set out. Their headlamps were still necessary beneath the dimness of the forest. The first 2 miles passed without incident. Aurora maintained her usual pace, pointing out landmarks and sharing facts about the local ecosystem. But Nicholas barely responded. He walked with his head lowered, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack, breathing harder than expected for a relatively easy incline. Aurora had guided anxious hikers before, people afraid of bears, worried about their physical endurance, or intimidated by the vastness of the terrain. But this felt different. Nicholas radiated a very specific kind of fear, the fear of someone who is not imagining something but already knows it. When they reached the 3-mile mark, where the trail emerged from the dense forest and opened into a subalpine meadow area, Aurora noticed something that made her stop dead. The forest had gone completely silent. There were no birds in the branches. There was no wind moving the needles of the mountain hemlocks. No small animal was running through the undergrowth. There were only their footsteps on the compacted dirt trail and their breathing in the thin mountain air. In 8 years as a guide, Aurora had never experienced such absolute silence in those woods. Even in the depths of winter, there were always sounds. Ravens calling, branches creaking, the whisper of snow falling from overloaded limbs. Nicholas sensed it too. He stopped and slowly turned in place. His face was pale despite the effort of the climb. Aurora was about to suggest a break for water when Nicholas suddenly pointed at something off the trail. About 30 meters to the right stood an enormous western hemlock. Its trunk was easily 6 feet in diameter, old enough to have been growing when the first white settlers arrived in the Cascades. Symbols had been carved into its bark that Aurora had never seen before. They were not initials or hearts like the ones some irresponsible hikers carved into trees despite park regulations. They were complex geometric patterns, circles within circles, lines that curved and crossed in ways that became painful to look at for too long. The cuts appeared recent, so recent that sap was still seeping from the wounds in the bark and dripping downward in sticky amber-colored tears. Aurora approached the tree slowly, allowing her training as a guide to take over despite the discomfort she felt. Vandalism inside the national park was a serious matter and had to be documented and reported. She took out her phone to photograph it, but the screen refused to focus properly. Every image came out blurry. The symbols remained undefined no matter how many times she tried to capture them. Nicholas did not approach the tree. He stayed on the trail, staring into the forest with an expression that almost seemed like recognition, as if he had expected to find exactly that. Then Aurora saw the second tree. Another hemlock, this one about 50 meters deeper into the forest, marked with identical symbols. And beyond it, barely visible through the vegetation, a third tree. The markings formed a kind of route leading away from the maintained trail and into the wilderness, toward areas where Aurora knew there were no established paths, only steep ravines, fallen logs, and terrain too complicated to cross safely without specialized equipment. She turned toward Nicholas and discovered that he was already walking toward the marked trees. Aurora shouted at him to stop, that they had to remain on the trail, that she was required to report the vandalism to the rangers before continuing. But Nicholas did not stop. He moved forward with sudden determination, as if he had been waiting for that moment, as if the marked trees were exactly what he had come to find. Aurora had to make a decision. Let him go alone into dangerous terrain, or follow him and try to bring him back safe and sound. Her responsibility as a guide overcame the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. She hurried after him, pulling the radio from her belt at the same time to call the ranger station. The radio crackled with static, but no voice came through, even though they were within range of the nearest repeater. The symbols led them through increasingly difficult terrain. Aurora had to help Nicholas climb over fallen logs and guide him around clusters of devil's club, whose branches were covered in cruel, sharp spines. The silence continued, heavy and unnatural. Aurora's heart pounded hard in her chest, and not because of the physical effort. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to the trail, to get out of those woods. But Nicholas kept moving forward with almost manic determination, barely stopping to catch his breath. Aurora grabbed him by the arm and forced him to stop. She demanded to know what they were looking for, why he had really hired her, and what he knew about those symbols. Nicholas finally looked at her with eyes filled with desperation and resignation. He told her he had already been there before, 15 years earlier, with 3 friends. They had found something in those woods, something that should not exist. His friends had wanted to tell other people, to come back with cameras and prove what they had seen. Nicholas had been the only one who wanted to leave and never return. His 3 friends went back without him a week later. They were never seen again. Their cars were found at the trailhead. Their equipment was never recovered. The search and rescue operation lasted for weeks, but it turned up nothing. No tracks, no clues. Just 3 people who vanished into the Cascades as if they had never existed. Before Aurora could respond, before she could process what Nicholas had just told her, they pushed through a dense patch of young hemlocks and emerged into a clearing. The trees formed a perfect circle. Their trunks were spaced at equal distances from one another, growing in a formation that could not be natural. The ground was bare earth. There was no undergrowth, no fallen needles, no leaves, nothing except a smooth and empty surface. And in the clearing, arranged in a circle and facing the center, were 7 figures wearing cloaks and hoods. They were completely still. They did not breathe. The fabric did not move in the breeze, even though mercifully the air had finally begun to blow again. The cloaks were made of a dark gray fabric, rough and heavy, with an ancient appearance. Aurora's first thought was that they had interrupted some kind of ceremony or ritual. Her second was to apologize and back away. But then she noticed the details that made her blood run cold. The figures cast no shadows, even though the morning light entered at an angle between the trees. The grass was not flattened beneath their feet. In fact, their feet did not touch the ground. They floated half an inch above the earth, suspended in an impossible way. Nicholas gripped Aurora's arm so tightly that she would later have bruises. He whispered that they had to leave immediately, that very instant. Not the way they had come, but in any other direction. But Aurora stood frozen, unable to look away from those figures, unable to understand what she was seeing. Then the figures moved. They did not turn their heads. They did not rotate their bodies. One moment they were facing the center of the circle. The next they were facing Aurora and Nicholas, as if they had simply existed in both positions at the same time, without passing through the movement that should have connected one posture to the other. The hoods were deep and dark, and Aurora instinctively knew that she did not want to see what was beneath them. But the morning sun shifted, and a beam of light fell across the face of the nearest figure. There was nothing there. It was not a face hidden by shadows. It was pure absence. The hood framed a void, a space where features should have been, but where nothing existed. A darkness that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. Aurora's mind struggled to understand what her eyes were showing her. The human brain is not designed to process the sight of a person without a face, without features, with nothing but emptiness in the place where humanity should be. That contradiction caused her physical pain, a sharp stab of pressure behind her eyes that made her gasp. That gasp seemed to be a signal. The figures advanced toward them. They did not walk. They glided. They closed the distance at an impossible speed. Nicholas pulled Aurora backward, and both of them ran. Branches tore at their faces and hands. Roots seemed to try to trip them. The forest had transformed into a maze of obstacles deliberately stretching toward them. Behind them, Aurora could sense that something was following. It was not footsteps. It was not breathing. It was a presence, a shifting of the air, something immense moving among the trees. They forced their way through the undergrowth. Aurora's training and her knowledge of the terrain vanished beneath the pure impulse of panic. Nicholas fell twice, and both times Aurora lifted him and pushed him forward. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs began to tremble. They ran until Aurora no longer had any idea where they were or which direction led back to the trail. Then, as suddenly as the nightmare had begun, they burst out onto the maintained trail. The Cascade Pass path stretched in front of them, solid, real, and normal. The terrible silence had disappeared. Birds sang in the trees. A marmot whistled in alarm from the rocks above. The world had made sense again. Aurora and Nicholas collapsed onto the trail, breathing hard. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. When Aurora finally had enough air to use the radio, it worked perfectly. Her call to the ranger station came through clearly. She reported their location and said they were heading out immediately due to an emergency situation. She did not try to explain what kind of emergency. She knew how it would sound. They reached the trailhead in record time, practically jogging downhill despite their exhaustion. Aurora took both of them to the ranger station where she gave a report. She told them about the symbols carved into the trees, about the clearing with the figures, about the chase through the forest. The rangers listened to her with professional courtesy, but Aurora could see the skepticism in their eyes. They probably thought she and Nicholas had eaten mushrooms or suffered some kind of shared panic attack. Even so, they agreed to send a team to investigate. 6 hours later, the investigation team returned. They found no carved trees. They found no symbols. They found no clearing with trees forming a perfect circle. The GPS coordinates Aurora had provided led to an area of dense forest with no signs of human presence, no disturbances in the undergrowth, no indication that anyone had been there. The rangers gently suggested that altitude and physical exertion might have caused confusion, that the human mind could play tricks in stressful situations, that perhaps Aurora should take a break from her work as a guide. Nicholas left immediately after giving his statement. He did not say goodbye to Aurora. He got into his rental car, drove away, and she never heard from him again. Weeks later, she tried to find him. She looked up the email address he had used to contact her, but the messages bounced back as invalid. The phone number he had provided was disconnected. It was as if Nicholas himself had been erased. Aurora continued guiding hikes through the Cascades. She had bills to pay and a reputation to maintain. She told herself it had all been altitude sickness, dehydration, or some psychological break caused by stress. She repeated that to herself because the alternative was impossible. But from then on, she refused to take clients off established trails, no matter how much money they offered her. She stayed on maintained paths, on the routes that appeared on the official park maps, in the places where hundreds of hikers walked every day. Sometimes she still saw the symbols, in the patterns of old tree bark, in the way shadows fell across stones. Her mind tried to find those shapes everywhere, as if seeing them once had opened a door in her perception that could no longer be closed. And at night, when sleep pulled her deeper than she wanted to go, Aurora dreamed of that clearing. She dreamed that she was standing in the center of the circle, surrounded by the 7 figures. In her dream, she could see what was beneath the hoods. She saw what existed inside that terrible absence where faces should have been. She always woke before dawn, her heart racing and the sheets soaked with sweat. She made coffee and sat by the window, watching as the sky brightened over the mountains, grateful to have survived another night, grateful that she had run when she had the chance, grateful that she had not looked longer at whatever had been in the clearing, because a part of her, the part that woke her screaming some nights, suspected that the figures had let them go, that Nicholas had been brought there to see something, to remember something, and that she had been nothing more than an unfortunate witness. She suspected that the Cascades contained spaces where the normal rules did not apply, places where things existed that should not exist, zones where the barrier between the possible and the impossible became dangerously thin. Aurora still guides hikers through those mountains, but she no longer takes anyone to hidden places. She remains where the maps say she should remain. She walks where thousands of people have walked safely. And if a client ever asks why she does not accept special requests to visit remote places, she simply says the terrain is too dangerous. She does not tell them the truth, that some places in those mountains do not want to be found by the kind of people who later come back, that there are clearings in those woods where faceless figures wait in patient circles, that the forests of the Cascades keep secrets darker than the shadows of the old-growth forest, secrets that are carved into living wood and human memory with the same permanence. Some nights she thinks of Nicholas and his 3 friends, who disappeared 15 years earlier. She wonders whether on that second visit they found what they were looking for. She wonders whether they are still somehow in those woods, in that clearing, standing in their own circle, looking inward forever. She wonders whether one day she will be guiding a hike and see the symbols again, marking the trees, showing the way to a place she does not want to return to, but perhaps will not be able to resist. Those are the nights when Aurora does not sleep at all. She stays awake until dawn, watching, making sure that if something comes down from those mountains looking for her, at least she will see it coming. The Cascades are beautiful in daylight, majestic, pure and breathtaking. But Aurora now knows what waits in the spaces between the trails. She knows what stands in the clearings where no one should walk, and she will never stop knowing it. She will never stop remembering it. She will never stop seeing those symbols carved into her memory with the same depth with which they were carved into the bark of trees that no longer show any scars. Story 2. Ellie was a wildlife biologist who studied spotted owl populations in the old-growth forests surrounding Mount Rainier. She had spent much of the last 3 years conducting field research in some of the most remote areas of the Cascades, places where the trees were so old and so tall that their crowns formed a permanent twilight at ground level, even on the brightest days. Her work required her to spend weeks in complete solitude, hiking miles into trailless forests to install audio recording equipment capable of capturing the territorial calls of the northern spotted owl, an endangered species. Most people would have found that isolation unbearable, but Ellie had always been comfortable being alone in nature. She found peace in that silence, interrupted only by birdsong and the whisper of wind moving through the needles of Douglas firs. Solitude had never made her uncomfortable. Not until the 3rd week at her research site in February, when winter still held the high country trapped and the forest remained locked in frozen silence. Ellie's research protocol was simple, though exhausting. She hiked into a designated area carrying recording equipment, established a base camp, and spent 2 weeks documenting owl activity through auditory monitoring. The recorders ran continuously, capturing everything that happened within a quarter-mile radius. During the day, Ellie checked the devices, downloaded the data onto her laptop, and reviewed hours of recordings in search of the distinctive four-note call of the spotted owl. At night, she stayed inside her tent, analyzing data and preparing her field notes. She had completed that routine successfully at a dozen different sites without anything strange happening. The forest had always seemed like a sanctuary to her, a place of scientific research and natural beauty. That perception changed during her third night at the new study site, a valley covered with western red cedars and hemlocks that had been growing since before European settlers arrived in the Pacific Northwest. Ellie had placed her recording devices in a triangular pattern, with each unit positioned about 200 meters from her camp. The equipment was advanced, capable of capturing sounds too faint or too high-pitched to be detected by the human ear. At dusk on the third day, she sat inside her tent reviewing the recordings from the previous night. She had her headphones on and was listening to the ambient sounds of the nighttime forest. For the most part, there was only silence, occasionally interrupted by the snap of a branch or the distant call of a great horned owl. Then, exactly at 2:47 in the morning, according to the timestamp, she heard something that made her fingers freeze above the keyboard. A voice, a human voice whispering her name. Ellie. She rewound the recording and played it again. The voice was clear, impossible to mistake. It said her name slowly, as if testing the feel of each syllable. Ellie. She checked the recorded time again. 2:47 a.m. At that hour, she had been asleep, alone in her tent, 5 miles from the nearest maintained trail, and at least 10 miles from anywhere someone else would have any reason to be. She told herself it had to be some kind of acoustic anomaly. Wind passing through the trees, producing sounds that resembled human speech. The auditory equivalent of seeing faces in clouds. The human brain is designed to find patterns even when none exist. But she played the recording a dozen more times, and each time it seemed more obvious that it was her name, whispered by a human voice. That night, Ellie barely slept. She kept her headlamp on and left the satellite phone within reach, even though she knew there was no one she could reasonably call. What would she say? That her recording equipment had captured someone whispering her name in the middle of a forest where no one else should be. It sounded absurd, even inside her own mind. But as she lay awake inside her sleeping bag, listening to the ordinary sounds of the nighttime forest, she could not shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The forest no longer felt neutral. It felt attentive, aware. The next day, Ellie seriously considered packing everything up and leaving early. She could report an equipment malfunction, weather concerns, or any of the many acceptable reasons for abandoning a research site before completing the full 2-week observation period. But 3 years of graduate work depended on collecting enough data, and spotted owls were difficult subjects to study. Abandoning a site meant losing valuable research time and disappointing the professors and agencies funding her work. She decided to stay, though she took precautions. She moved her tent closer to the equipment, within visual range of all 3 recording stations. She kept pepper spray and an emergency whistle attached to her jacket at all times. And that night she stayed awake, sitting outside the tent with her headlamp and laptop, determined to witness anything that happened at 2:47 in the morning. The forest at night was an entirely different world from the forest during the day. Darkness amplified every sound and created spaces where imagination could run wild without limits. Ellie sat in a camping chair, wrapped in a thick down jacket, while her breath formed small clouds in the frozen air. She watched the clock on her computer slowly approach 2:47. At 2:45, she turned off her headlamp and let her eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon was almost full, providing just enough light to distinguish the silhouettes of the enormous trees surrounding her camp. Exactly at 2:47 a.m., she heard it with her own ears. Not through the recording equipment, not filtered through headphones, but alive, immediate, floating in the cold night air. Her name whispered from somewhere in the darkness beyond the tent. Ellie. The voice came from the direction of the western recording station, about 200 meters away. Then she heard something that made every muscle in her body tense. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, moving through the low vegetation. It was not the quick scurrying of a raccoon or the cautious movement of a deer. They were measured steps made by something walking on two legs, something in no hurry, something that knew exactly where it was going. The footsteps began circling her camp. Ellie grabbed the flashlight with trembling hands and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks, hanging moss, and shadows, but nothing else. The footsteps continued, indifferent to the light, moving steadily from her left to her right. She swept the flashlight in an arc, trying to find the source of the sound, but she saw nothing. Only trees, shadows, and the pale vegetation made up of ferns and salal. Even so, the footsteps were unmistakable now, close enough that she should have been able to see whatever was producing them. Then she saw the shadow. It moved between two enormous cedars, visible for only an instant at the edge of her flashlight beam. It was too tall to be human, at least 7 feet, perhaps more. It moved with a strange, unnatural fluidity, as if its joints bent in ways human joints should not bend. Ellie kept the flashlight fixed on the place where she had seen it, but the shadow did not appear again. The footsteps continued circling her, never changing rhythm, never stopping. They went around and around the camp, maintaining a constant distance of perhaps 50 feet, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to remain hidden in the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. For 18 minutes, Ellie sat frozen in her chair while something circled her camp. She counted the minutes on her watch, clinging to a concrete task to keep her mind from falling into absolute panic. 18 minutes of steady footsteps, occasionally interrupted by the snap of a twig or the rustle of disturbed ferns. Then, as abruptly as they had begun, the footsteps stopped. The forest returned to its usual nighttime stillness. Ellie remained motionless for another hour, the flashlight clenched in her hand, before finally retreating inside the tent. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against her backpack, the satellite phone on her lap, watching the entrance of the tent until dawn came and the forest began to resemble something normal again. In the morning light, Ellie examined the area around the camp. If something had circled her tent for 18 minutes, there had to be evidence. Tracks, broken vegetation, some sign of passage. She found nothing. The forest floor showed no strange disturbance. There were no tracks except her own. It was as if whatever had walked around her tent had left no more evidence than a ghost. She should have left that very morning. Every rational instinct told her to pack her equipment and leave immediately. But Ellie had spent her entire adult life preparing to be a scientist, learning to observe, to document, to search for evidence and rational explanations. She told herself there had to be an explanation, some animal unknown to her, acoustic tricks caused by the shape of the terrain, hallucinations induced by stress and isolation. She decided to stay one more night and document anything that happened using all the recording equipment available. That day, Ellie installed additional cameras aimed toward her camp. She checked every device again and again, making sure everything was functioning properly. She positioned her tent so that she had a clear view of the western recording station, where the voice seemed to have originated. She prepared her backpack so she could evacuate quickly if necessary, leaving only essential items inside the tent. And when night fell again, she believed she was ready, or at least she thought so. At 2:47 a.m., the whispers began again, but this time they were closer, much closer, right outside her tent. Ellie. The voice was directly on the other side of the thin nylon fabric, so close that she could hear the breath behind the word. Then the footsteps began again, but instead of circling the camp from a distance, they moved around the tent itself, only inches from where she was sitting. Ellie did not grab the flashlight. A deep survival instinct told her that seeing what was outside would be worse than not seeing it. She stayed frozen, listening to the footsteps circle the tent. 1 loop, 2, 3. On the 4th loop, she saw the fabric of the tent begin to move. Something was pressing against it from outside, forming a bulge that moved along the wall at approximately shoulder height. It did not look like an animal brushing against the tent, but like something passing a hand over the fabric, feeling the shape of the structure, perhaps searching for the entrance. Then the zipper began to open. Ellie watched in horror as the zipper of her tent entrance slowly descended, pulled by something she could not see. Inch by inch it opened, and the sound of the metal teeth separating was impossibly loud in the middle of the silence. Through the widening opening, she could see only darkness, and she knew with absolute certainty that she did not want to see what was on the other side. She threw herself forward and hurled her entire body against the wall of the tent, collapsing the whole structure. The poles snapped. The fabric tore. Ellie struggled out of the tangle of nylon and aluminum, emerging into the night air with her heart pounding hard and adrenaline flooding her body. There was nothing there. She swept the flashlight across the entire camp. Empty. No figure. No shadow. No sign that anything had been there. But when she pointed the flashlight at the ground directly around the collapsed tent, she saw something that froze her blood. Footprints in the frost that had formed on the ground. Bare footprints, human-shaped but wrong. Too large. The toes too long. And each foot had 6 toes instead of 5. Ellie did not pack her things. She did not try to rescue the equipment. She grabbed the backpack with her essential supplies and the satellite phone and ran. She ran through the dark forest with only her headlamp lighting the way, tripping over roots and forcing her way through the undergrowth, not caring about the noise she made or the branches that scratched her face and hands. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs shook. And then she kept running. It took her 4 hours to cover the 5 miles to the nearest trail and another 3 hours to reach the ranger station. She appeared just after dawn, exhausted and bleeding from dozens of small cuts, but alive. The rangers listened to her story with expressions that shifted from concern to skepticism. They sent a team to investigate, but the team found her camp exactly as it had been before she arrived. There was no collapsed tent. There was no scattered equipment. Everything Ellie had left behind had simply disappeared. The recording devices, the cameras, the tent, her research materials. Everything had vanished as if it had never existed. The only things Ellie still had were what she had been carrying when she ran, and the scratches on her face and arms caused by her desperate flight through the forest. Ellie reported the incident to her university advisors. She filed documentation with the National Park Service. She tried to explain what had happened, but she could see it in their faces. They believed she had suffered some kind of breakdown. A young researcher, alone for too long in the wilderness, cracking under the pressure of isolation. They recommended that she take a break, see a counselor, and reconsider whether field biology was truly the right career path for her. 3 months later, Ellie transferred to another research project dedicated to studying salmon populations in eastern Oregon. A job that involved daytime outings and nights in hotels, not tents. A job that never required her to remain alone in the forest after nightfall. Her professors expressed disappointment. She had shown so much potential as a field researcher, but Ellie did not care about their disappointment. She had heard her name whispered in a voice that should not exist. She had felt something circling her tent in the darkness. She had seen footprints with 6 toes. Now she knows that there are places in the forests of the Cascades where the rules of the natural world do not fully apply. Places where something else lives. Something that knows the names of those who ventured too far from established trails. Something that whispers in the darkness and leaves no tracks except in frost. Something capable of making recorders, tents, and all evidence of human presence disappear as if they had never been there. Ellie will never return to those forests. She avoids hiking. She shudders when she hears footsteps behind her on city streets. And sometimes in that suspended instant between wakefulness and sleep, she hears it again. Her name whispered in the darkness. Ellie. She wakes with her heart racing, telling herself it was only a dream, only a memory, nothing more. But some nights she is not so sure. Some nights she wonders whether whatever was in those woods followed her somehow, whether it stayed with her like a scent she cannot wash away. She tells herself she is safe now, surrounded by civilization, far from the ancient forests of the Cascades. But deep down, in that part of her mind that still lives trapped in the instant when the tent zipper began to open, she knows the truth. Distance does not matter. Whatever whispered her name in the darkness knows where she is. It always has. And someday, in some silent moment when she is alone, she may hear those footsteps again, slow and steady, circling her, patient, waiting for the moment to whisper her name once more. Story 3. Adam and Sadie were professional photographers who had dedicated the last 5 years to documenting the waterfalls of the Pacific Northwest. Over time, they had built a solid reputation for capturing images that magazines and travel websites paid high prices to publish. Their photographs showed familiar landscapes from unexpected angles, with lighting that sometimes seemed almost supernatural. Their success came from their willingness to go where other photographers did not dare. They obtained permits to enter restricted areas, hiked off trail, and reached places that required technical climbing skills and a high tolerance for risk. They were good at what they did, and they took pride in finding shots no one else could repeat. In early April, they managed to obtain permits to access a restricted section of the Columbia River Gorge, an area that had remained closed to the public for more than 2 years after the Eagle Creek fire. The Forest Service was conducting restoration assessments, and the trails were still officially closed while crews cleared hazards and monitored possible landslides. But Adam had contacts with a ranger who owed him a favor, and because of that, they received special authorization to spend a single day photographing inside the burned area. The ranger warned them that the area was dangerous, that trees weakened by fire could fall without warning, and that the terrain was unstable in some places. Adam and Sadie signed liability waivers and promised to stay in radio contact. They were looking for something very specific, a waterfall hidden deep inside the restricted area, a place very few people knew existed. According to rumor, that waterfall had escaped the worst of the fire damage. They began hiking before dawn, carrying cameras, tripods, and specialized lighting equipment. The trail was overgrown in some sections, clearly showing the lack of regular maintenance that occurs when an area remains closed for a long time. Scars from the fire marked many of the trees, black bands climbing trunks that somehow had survived the flames. But as they moved deeper into the restricted area, the forest became denser and greener. They were entering a valley the fire had barely touched, a pocket of old-growth forest surrounded by devastation. By mid-morning, they reached their destination. The waterfall was everything they had hoped for and more. The water descended down a basalt wall in 3 clearly defined tiers. Mist from the falls formed rainbows in the morning light. Western red cedars and hemlocks surrounded the waterfall, their branches heavy with moss and ferns. Fog floated in the air like silk, softening the sunlight until it became something dim and dreamlike. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of place capable of producing portfolio-worthy images. Adam set up the first camera while Sadie adjusted the tripod, checking angles and framing. The sound of falling water filled the air with an almost meditative white noise. This was why they did the work. For those moments when they found themselves alone in places of pure natural beauty, creating art that would allow others to see what very few people ever witnessed in person. Adam took several test shots, checking the exposure and composition on the camera's preview screen. Everything looked good. He signaled for Sadie to move to another position so he could capture her silhouette against the waterfall and use it as a reference for scale. That was when he noticed them in the frame. Behind Sadie, among the trees at the edge of the clearing, were people. At least a dozen figures standing completely still, watching them. Adam lowered the camera and looked with his own eyes. There was nothing, only trees, ferns, and mist. He raised the camera again and looked at the preview screen. The figures were there, clear as day, standing among the trees. Men and women dressed in clothing that looked old-fashioned, dark jackets and long dresses from another era. All of them were facing Adam and Sadie, all completely still. Adam called Sadie over and showed her the camera screen. She looked at the image, then turned to look at the trees behind her. Nothing visible. They walked to the place where the figures appeared in the photograph. There were no footprints, no disturbed moss, no proof that anyone had been standing there. Adam took another photo of the same area. Now the figures were closer. They were still among the trees, but they were unmistakably nearer than in the first image. Sadie took out her own camera and looked through the viewfinder. She turned pale and slowly lowered the device. She told Adam she could see them through the lens, clearly, in enough detail to make out their faces. Hollow eyes stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Their expressions were not quite right. Their mouths were just slightly too wide. Their features were just wrong enough to awaken a deep, instinctive revulsion. But when she lowered the camera, there was nothing there. They should have left immediately. They both felt it, that primitive warning that something was deeply wrong in that place. But they were professionals, and this was the kind of unexplained phenomenon that could define a career if they managed to document it properly. For the next 20 minutes, they took photographs, dozens of them, from different angles and with different equipment. Every image showed the figures, and in each successive photograph, the figures were closer. The watchers began appearing in every direction. Through the camera viewfinders, Adam and Sadie could see themselves surrounded by a silent crowd. The figures were now at the edges of the clearing, forming a ring of spectators dressed in clothes from a century earlier, all staring at them with those wrong faces and those empty eyes. None of them moved. They simply stood there, watching with an attention that felt malignant. Adam tried to review the photos on his camera screen, wanting to check whether the images showed some detail that could explain what they were seeing. But something was wrong with the screen. The figures inside the photographs were moving, not with the choppy movement of a frame-by-frame video, but fluidly, as if he were looking through a window into something alive. In the images, the watchers were walking toward the center of the frame, toward the spot where Adam and Sadie had been standing when the photos were taken. They advanced slowly but inevitably. Sadie grabbed Adam's arm and pointed at her own camera. The same thing was happening to her. The figures in her viewfinder were moving now too. They were no longer just standing there. They were walking toward them with slow, deliberate steps. When Sadie aimed the camera at the trees, she could see the watchers advancing through the clearing. Their feet did not seem to fully touch the ground. More than walking, they glided, moving toward the place where she and Adam stood. They made the decision to leave without needing to say it. Some instinct older than language told them both that they were in immediate danger, that what they were seeing through their cameras was not simply an optical phenomenon or an equipment malfunction. It was something real, something threatening, something that existed in a layer of reality that human eyes normally could not perceive. They gathered all the equipment they could carry quickly and ran, leaving thousands of dollars worth of gear behind. The return to the trailhead took them half the time it had taken to reach the waterfall. They forced their way through the brush, climbed over fallen logs, and kept moving without worrying about the noise or the damage to their clothing. Behind them, always out of sight but definitely present, they heard sounds. They were not exactly footsteps, but a displacement of air, a sensation of movement, a presence that matched their pace and seemed to push them in a specific direction. When they finally burst onto the main trail, the presence vanished. The forest regained its normal sounds. Birds called. A squirrel chattered among the branches. Water ran in a nearby stream. The world made sense again. Adam and Sadie collapsed onto the trail, gasping, looking behind them for a pursuit that never materialized. The ranger who had granted them access was waiting for them at the trailhead when they emerged 2 hours later. One look at their faces was enough for him to ask what had happened. Adam tried to explain, but the words sounded absurd when spoken aloud under the bright afternoon light. The ranger listened without expression and then asked whether they wanted to file a formal report. They refused. What were they going to say? That they had seen ghosts through their camera viewfinders? That figures from a century earlier had chased them through the forest? 3 days later, the ranger called Adam. A recovery team had entered the restricted area to collect the equipment they had left behind. Everything was exactly where they had dropped it. The cameras, the tripods, the lighting equipment, everything remained intact. But when they checked the memory cards, every photograph was blank, pure white. There were no images. Not just the photos where the figures appeared, but every single shot they had taken that day. Total data corruption across several cards belonging to different cameras. The ranger said technical failures sometimes happen in the field, but Adam could hear the doubt in his voice. Adam and Sadie never returned to the Columbia River Gorge. They sold their photography equipment 2 months later and went their separate ways. Adam moved to California and began working in real estate photography, a safe job indoors, with artificial lighting and no surprises. Sadie accepted a position teaching graphic design at a community college. Neither of them ever picked up a camera for personal work again after that day. Sometimes Adam dreams of the watchers. He sees them standing in groups at the edges of rooms, staring at him with those hollow eyes and those wrong faces. In his dreams, they are always closer, advancing slowly but steadily. He always wakes before they reach him. But he knows that sooner or later in some dream, they will close the distance completely. And he wonders what will happen then. Sadie tells people she lost interest in photography, that she became exhausted by the freelance lifestyle and wanted something more stable. She does not tell them the truth. That sometimes she sees the watchers at the edge of her vision, standing at the edges of crowds, in reflections in store windows, in the shadows of parking lots, always watching, always still, always dressed in clothes from another era. Adam and Sadie never spoke to each other about what happened. The experience destroyed both their professional partnership and their friendship. There are things that cannot be shared without breaking something fundamental between people. Some experiences isolate instead of uniting. The waterfall inside the restricted area still exists. It still descends down the basalt wall in 3 beautiful tiers. Over time, the Forest Service reopened some of the trails in that section of the gorge. Hikers now frequently pass within less than a mile of that place. Some of them probably find the clearing now and photograph the waterfall with their phones and digital cameras. Adam sometimes wonders whether any of them have seen figures in their images, whether anyone else has looked through a lens and seen the watchers standing among the trees, whether anyone else has felt that terrible attention focused on them. But most of the time, he tries not to think about it. He now lives in a world of lit rooms and artificial light, a world where cameras capture exactly what the eye can see, and nothing more. A world where the past remains safely in the past, and the dead stay dead. He needs to believe that world is the only real one. Because the alternative, the idea that there are layers of reality bleeding through in certain places, and under certain conditions, visible only through the specific wavelengths captured by camera lenses, is too terrible to accept. The Cascades are full of beautiful places, places where light, water, and stone create scenes of overwhelming beauty. But some of those places have watchers, and the watchers remember, and they wait, and they appear in photographs that should show nothing but trees, mist, and falling water. And sometimes, if you are unlucky enough to see them, they begin to move. Story 4. Gavin was an experienced backcountry ranger responsible for maintaining remote trails in the North Cascades. He had worked in those mountains for 12 years, longer than anyone else in his district. He knew the trail system better than the maps themselves, better even than what the GPS coordinates indicated. Every junction, every landmark, every mile marker was engraved in his memory after countless patrols in every season and under every kind of weather condition. He could navigate the wilderness in fog, in darkness, or in the middle of a snowstorm with almost zero visibility. He took pride in never getting lost, in being the ranger other rangers called when they needed to find missing hikers or verify confusing trail reports. His knowledge of those mountains was encyclopedic, earned through thousands of miles traveled on foot. That experience was precisely what made what happened even more impossible to explain. It all began with a series of reports from hikers about a trail that, according to them, had become confusing. 3 different groups, over the course of 2 weeks, contacted the ranger station to report that they had become disoriented on the Furry Creek Trail, a simple out-and-back route that led 6 miles to an alpine lake. The trail was rated easy to moderate, well-marked, and heavily traveled during the summer season. It was not the kind of route where experienced hikers usually got lost. However, all 3 groups reported the same thing. They had reached a junction that should not exist. They became disoriented while trying to decide how to continue and eventually turned back without reaching the lake. One of the groups had spent 3 hours trying to find the correct path before giving up. Gavin dismissed the matter as a case of inexperienced hikers misreading their maps. People got confused in the wilderness more often than they were willing to admit, and their egos invented excuses. Reporting a non-existent junction was easier than admitting they had simply taken the wrong direction. Gavin volunteered to inspect the trail personally, mostly to close the matter. He packed lightly, planning a quick day hike to the lake and back. He carried GPS, a compass, detailed trail maps, and his radio. He had walked that particular route at least 24 times over the years. He expected to find nothing out of the ordinary. The morning was clear and cool, perfect for hiking. Gavin moved at a steady pace along the familiar trail, taking note of the conditions and checking for possible hazards. Everything looked normal. The route was well maintained. The markers were in place. The terrain matched his memories exactly. At 2 miles, he should be approaching a small creek crossing. At 4 miles, a distinctive rock formation. At 6 miles, the lake. Simple, direct, impossible to confuse. But when he reached the 2-mile mark, Gavin found something that made him stop dead. A trail junction. 2 paths split into the forest, both equally traveled, both appearing legitimate. His map did not show any junction for another 5 miles. The GPS coordinates confirmed that he was exactly where he believed he was, but the device did not register any trail junction at that point. The route database had been updated only 3 months earlier. There should not have been any junction there. Gavin examined both paths carefully. They looked identical. They had the same width, the same level of maintenance, the same kind of markers. One led roughly northeast, which was the correct direction toward the lake. The other headed more directly north. According to the map, he should continue on the trail that angled northeast. He marked the coordinates of the junction on his GPS and moved on. 30 minutes later, he reached a junction. The same junction. He was certain. The same 2 paths, the same markers, the same exact configuration. But that was impossible. He had been walking steadily uphill on a trail that should have carried him deeper into the wilderness. There was no loop that could return him to the same point. Gavin checked the GPS. The coordinates showed that he had traveled almost a mile from the junction, but he was standing in what appeared to be exactly the same place. He tried again, this time taking the more northern path. He walked for 40 minutes, paying extreme attention to the landmarks. The trail climbed steadily through the old-growth forest, passing enormous western hemlocks and Douglas firs. Nothing in the terrain suggested that he was walking in a circle. Even so, after 40 minutes, he emerged at the same junction again. The same junction. The same 2 trails disappearing into the trees. Gavin sat down and forced himself to think calmly. Disorientation was a known phenomenon. Without clear visual cues, even the most experienced navigators could become confused. But he had a compass. He had GPS. He had been walking in a straight line on a maintained trail. There was no rational explanation for returning to the same point 3 times in a row. The forest around him was beginning to look different. The trees seemed taller than they should. The bark looked darker and more deeply furrowed. The light filtering through the canopy had taken on a strange quality. Too green, too dense, as if he were underwater. The air felt heavy and motionless. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered. The silence was deep and unnatural. Gavin tried to use the radio. Only static. The GPS had stopped working completely. The screen was frozen on coordinates that no longer updated. His compass spun slowly, unable to settle toward north. Every piece of technology he carried had stopped behaving properly. He was alone in a forest that no longer followed the rules he understood. He tried a 4th time. He took the northeast trail, but this time he marked trees with his knife as he went, carving distinctive signs into the bark so he would know if he was truly returning to places he had already passed. He walked for an hour. The marked trees appeared behind him at regular intervals, proof that he was moving forward, The trail continued to climb. The vegetation changed in a way consistent with increasing elevation. Everything indicated that he was moving deeper and deeper into the wilderness. Then he saw his first marked tree in front of him. Then the second. Then the third. Somehow the trail had looped back on itself despite having climbed continuously. Gavin stared at the marks he himself had made in a tree, trying to understand what was happening. The laws of physical space were not functioning correctly. The trail was folding back on itself in ways that defied geometry. That was when he saw her. A woman standing on the trail about 50 meters away. She was wearing a ranger uniform, but the style was not right. The cut of the jacket looked old. The patches had different designs. The entire uniform seemed to come from the 1970s or 1980s. She stood completely still, facing him, smiling. Even from 50 meters away, Gavin could tell that something was wrong with her eyes. They were completely black. No whites, no irises, only solid darkness from edge to edge, like the eyes of a shark. The woman lifted one hand and beckoned him closer. "Come with me," the gesture seemed to say. "I will show you the way." But every instinct Gavin possessed screamed at him to run. That woman was not human. Her smile was not friendly. Her black eyes contained nothing but malevolence. She was something wearing the shape of a ranger, using a familiar image to lure him deeper into the trap that trail had become. Gavin turned around and ran in the opposite direction. He forced his way violently through the brush, abandoning the trail completely. He no longer cared about direction or landmarks. He only needed to get away from the junction, from the black-eyed woman, from the trail that returned endlessly to itself. Branches scratched his face and backpack. Roots tried to trip him. He fell twice, dragged himself back up, and kept running. He ran for what felt like hours, though perhaps it was only minutes. In that forest, time had become as unreliable as space. Finally exhausted, his lungs burning, Gavin collapsed against an enormous cedar and forced himself to stop. He had to think. Panic would kill him faster than anything else out there. Then he heard the sound of a vehicle, a car engine nearby. Gavin pushed through one final cluster of trees and stumbled out onto a road. The pavement beneath his boots was solid and real. A logging truck roared past, and the driver looked at him curiously. Gavin stood on the shoulder, trying to orient himself. According to the road marker, he was on State Route 20 miles from the place where he had begun the hike. 20 miles. He had crossed terrain that would have required 2 days to cover. He had crossed ridgelines and valleys that stretched between his starting point and that road, and yet only a few hours had passed since he left the trailhead. When his GPS finally began working again, it confirmed the impossible. He was 20 miles from his starting point, but the route log indicated that he had only traveled 6 miles. Gavin called for someone to pick him up and waited beside the road. When his supervisor arrived, Gavin tried to explain what had happened. The junction that should not exist. The trail that repeated itself impossibly. The woman in the old ranger uniform with black eyes. He could hear how absurd it sounded. Like a nervous breakdown, altitude sickness, dehydration, or a psychological crisis. His supervisor was sympathetic but concerned. He suggested that Gavin take some time off, that he see a doctor, that he get tested for Lyme disease or other conditions that could cause confusion and disorientation. Gavin agreed because arguing would only make him sound worse, but he knew what he had experienced was real. A week later, a team went to investigate his claims. They walked the Furry Creek Trail from beginning to end without incident. They found no mysterious junctions, no repeating trails, no women in old ranger uniforms. The trail was exactly as the map said it should be. 6 miles of direct hiking to a beautiful alpine lake. The team completed the route in both directions without any problem. Their report suggested that Gavin had suffered a medical episode in the field and recommended that he undergo a complete neurological evaluation before returning to remote backcountry duties. Gavin took administrative leave. He spent 2 weeks trying to convince himself that it had all been some kind of hallucination, but the GPS log was real data showing impossible displacement. The cuts on his face from running through the brush were real wounds. The coordinates where the GPS had frozen were real numbers he could verify. Something had happened on that trail, something that defied every rational explanation. 3 weeks after his experience, Gavin submitted his resignation. He was 38 years old, in excellent physical condition, with 12 years of service and a flawless record. He could have worked another 25 years. He could have retired with a full pension. Instead, he left. His supervisor tried to talk him out of it, but Gavin stood firm. He was done with the North Cascades. He was done with backcountry ranger work. He was done with trails that should not exist, and black-eyed women dressed in ranger uniforms from decades past. Gavin moved to Montana. He now works for the Bureau of Land Management, managing grasslands and sagebrush prairies, where visibility stretches for miles in every direction. Open terrain, where trails go exactly where the maps say they go, where GPS always works, where space obeys the normal rules of geometry. He tells people he wanted a change of scenery, that 12 years in the Cascades had been enough. He does not tell them the truth. At night, Gavin sometimes dreams of that junction. He dreams that he is standing in front of the fork, trying to decide which path to take, knowing that both return to the same impossible point. In his dreams, the black-eyed woman is always there, standing at the end of one of the paths, beckoning him forward with that terrible smile. He always wakes before he has to decide whether to follow her. Sometimes he wonders whether other rangers have found that junction, whether the trail still folds back on itself in ways that defy physics, whether the woman still waits there in her old uniform, drawing people deep into a forest where the normal laws of reality do not apply. He wonders whether anyone else has been transported 20 miles across impossible terrain in a matter of hours, whether anyone else has experienced the North Cascades as a place where space folds back on itself like origami. But most of the time, he tries not to think about it. He stays in his prairies and grasslands, where the horizon is visible, and trails are straight lines crossing through understandable space. He tells himself he is satisfied with this new life, this safe life, this life where the worst thing that can happen is encountering a rattlesnake or getting caught in a thunderstorm. Dangers he understands, dangers that follow predictable rules, because the alternative is admitting that there are places in the mountains where the fabric of reality wears thin, where trails can exist in multiple configurations at the same time, where something that looks human can stand, smile, and beckon with eyes like open holes into the void, where nature is not dangerous only in the way cliffs or weather are dangerous, but in ways that have no name and no rational explanation. The North Cascades are still there, drawing hikers and backpackers searching for beauty and solitude in nature. The trails still wind through ancient forests and climb toward alpine lakes. And somewhere in those mountains there is a junction that should not exist, a trail that repeats itself in defiance of geometry, a woman in a ranger uniform from another era, waiting patiently with her black eyes and her welcoming smile, waiting for the next person who strays too far from the routes marked on maps, waiting to show them the way into the deepest part of a forest where space does not function correctly and time becomes fluid and malleable, waiting to guide them toward places where lost rangers arrive and never return from. Gavin knows she is still there, still waiting, still smiling, and he knows he will never go back to discover where that smile might lead. Story 5. Lucy and Connor were wilderness rangers assigned to prepare a remote cabin for winter before the first snowfall of the season arrived. The cabin was 40 miles from the nearest road and accessible only by a 2-day hike through some of the most difficult terrain in the Cascades. It had been built in the 1960s as an emergency shelter for firefighters battling fires in remote areas. It was made of roughly hewn logs and located in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth forest. The structure was barely used anymore. Modern firefighting depended on helicopters and mobile camps. However, the Forest Service maintained it as a historic site and as an occasional refuge for lost or injured hikers. The winterizing process consisted of checking the structure for damage, sealing cracks against the weather, removing anything that might attract animals, and making sure the door and windows were properly secured. It was simple work that could usually be completed in a single day. Lucy and Connor arrived at the cabin just as dusk began to settle over the forest. They had pushed hard during the second day of hiking, wanting to reach the cabin with enough light to unload their packs and make a first assessment of the work. The clearing was covered in ferns and salal that had grown out of control. The cabin looked weathered but structurally sound. Its log walls were darkened by age and covered with moss. They checked the perimeter first, looking for signs of animal damage or structural weakening. Everything seemed intact. The door was still locked. The windows were not broken. The roof showed no major damage. They could complete the work in one day, just as they had planned, and begin the return trip the following morning. After securing the cabin and checking for immediate hazards, they prepared a simple dinner on their camp stove and settled in for the night. The cabin had bunk beds with old foam mattresses, a wood stove that still worked, and a small table with 2 chairs. It was austere but comfortable enough for experienced backcountry workers. They discussed the work plan for the next day, checked their equipment, and got ready to sleep. Lucy took the lower bunk and Connor the upper one. Outside, the forest was quiet except for the occasional call of an owl and the whisper of wind among the trees. Shortly after midnight, Lucy woke to a sound that put her on alert instantly. Scratching, loud and deliberate. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Something large was moving under the cabin, scraping against the wood with enough force for the sound to be clearly heard. Lucy stayed motionless, listening. The scratching followed a back-and-forth pattern, as if whatever was underneath was walking from one side to the other, or methodically exploring the underside of the floor. She whispered Connor's name. He was already awake. She knew it by his breathing. He was also listening to the sounds coming from below. Connor climbed down from the bunk in silence and grabbed his flashlight. Both of them had dealt with animals in remote cabins before. Usually they were mice or field rats, sometimes raccoons or even porcupines. Whatever was under the cabin sounded larger than any of those things, though it could have been a bear investigating the structure. Black bears sometimes made dens under buildings if they found a suitable space. Connor carefully opened the cabin door and stepped outside. Lucy followed with her own flashlight. They circled the structure, sweeping the light across the foundation and the entrance to the crawl space. The crawl space entrance was still sealed, intact. The metal mesh covering the opening was screwed into place, with no signs of having been forced or damaged. And yet the scratching continued, clearly audible even from outside the cabin. Connor and Lucy exchanged glances. If the entrance to the space beneath the floor was secured, how had something managed to get under there? There were no other openings large enough for anything bigger than a mouse to enter. They returned inside the cabin, but neither of them could sleep. The scratching continued intermittently throughout the night. Sometimes it stopped for an hour, then returned with renewed intensity. At times it sounded like claws scraping against the wood. Other times it seemed almost like fingers sliding against the boards. That difference disturbed Lucy deeply. When dawn finally arrived, she and Connor wasted no time and got to work. They decided to open the crawl space entrance and investigate it properly. Whatever was under there needed to be dealt with before they could finish the winterizing work. The entrance was on the north side of the cabin. It was a square opening about 2 feet wide, covered by a heavy metal mesh screwed into the foundation. Connor removed the bolts with a wrench from his toolbox and pulled the mesh aside. The opening revealed darkness and the smell of damp earth. Connor lay flat on his stomach and aimed the flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a low space barely 2 feet high, filled with rocks, dirt, and decades of accumulated debris. He crawled forward, pushing into the narrow darkness on his elbows. Lucy crouched by the entrance, watching and holding a second flashlight ready. Connor's voice echoed from inside the crawl space. At first, he reported that he did not see anything unusual, only dirt, stones, and the underside of the floorboards. Then his voice changed. He had found the scratches, deep grooves in the underside of the wood, so recent that splinters still hung from the cuts. The marks were extensive and covered large sections of the floor directly beneath the area where they had slept. Something had been down there recently, scraping the boards with considerable force. But the crawl space was too low for anything large. Connor had to move by dragging himself on his stomach, barely able to turn his head. There was no room for a bear or even a large raccoon to maneuver, yet the scratches suggested they had been made by something much larger than a mouse. He backed out with difficulty and emerged covered in dirt. His face showed concern. He told Lucy what he had found, but he could not explain it. The scratches were there. The space was too small. The facts did not fit. They talked about leaving immediately, abandoning the winterizing work and starting the return trip that very morning. But they were professionals with a task to complete, and nothing had directly threatened them. Strange scratching sounds were not reason enough to leave the job unfinished and waste a 40-mile hike. They decided to continue, though they planned to leave that same afternoon instead of spending another night there. If they worked efficiently, they could complete most of the essential tasks in a few hours. The day passed without incident. They sealed cracks in the walls, cleared the chimney, removed food that might attract mice, and secured the windows. The routine work helped normalize the situation. By late afternoon, they were nearly finished. Lucy was sweeping the floor while Connor made one final check of the door locks. That was when Lucy noticed something that made her stop sweeping. Between the floorboards and one of the cracks where light might have been able to filter through from below, she saw movement. She knelt and aimed the flashlight into the opening between two boards. An eye looked back at her from the other side. A human eye. Bloodshot, wide open, staring directly at her from the crack in the floor. Blinking. Lucy screamed and stumbled backward. Connor turned immediately, demanding to know what was happening. Lucy pointed at the floor, at the gap between the boards. Connor grabbed his flashlight and looked. Now there was nothing. Only darkness between the boards. But Lucy had seen it with complete clarity. A human eye watching her from the crawl space. A space too low to hold anything the size of a person. They made the decision in seconds. Grab the essential gear and leave immediately. They did not discuss it. They did not debate. They both knew they had to get out of the cabin in that instant. They packed the critical items into their backpacks, left the rest behind, and exited the cabin almost running. Lucy was shaking so badly she could barely tighten the straps on her pack. Connor's face was pale and rigid. They began walking without looking back, forcing themselves forward despite the difficult terrain. They walked all night using headlamps and pure determination to cover a route that would normally have taken 2 days. They did not stop to rest. They barely spoke. When they finally reached the trailhead at dawn, exhausted and covered in dirt, they immediately called their supervisor. Lucy told him they had found a dangerous situation at the cabin and had evacuated. She did not explain what kind of danger. She knew how it would sound. Her supervisor sent another team to investigate. The team found the cabin exactly as Lucy and Connor had left it. The work was partially finished and some of the equipment was still inside. They thoroughly checked the space beneath the floor. It was empty. The scratches on the underside of the boards were there, deep and recent, just as Connor had described. But the space was clearly too low for anything large to fit inside. The team completed the winterization and left without incident. Their report mentioned the unexplained scratches, but attributed them to an animal, possibly something small that had made them over a long period of time. Lucy requested a transfer to an office position in less than 2 weeks. She told her supervisor she was dealing with a family situation that required her to stay closer to civilization. Connor resigned from the Forest Service entirely. 3 months later, he moved to Seattle and accepted a job at a software company, as far away as he could get from any work in the wilderness. They did not stay in touch. The experience had damaged something between them. It had created shared knowledge that neither of them wanted to touch again. The Forest Service sealed the crawl space entrance with concrete later that same year. No official reason was given for the modification. The cabin itself was marked for demolition the following spring. Budget restrictions and low use were cited as justification. No one mentioned the scratches or the rangers who had evacuated in the middle of their assignment. The cabin was torn down in May. The logs were removed by helicopter. The clearing was left abandoned for the brush and ferns to cover again. Lucy still works for the Forest Service. but she will never again accept an assignment in remote areas. She processes permits, answers phones, and helps plan trail maintenance schedules from a comfortable office with windows facing a parking lot. Sometimes when she works late and the office is quiet, she thinks about that eye looking at her from beneath the floorboards. She wonders what it belonged to, how it could fit in a space too low for something the size of a human being, whether it is still in those mountains somewhere, crawling through spaces too small for its body, scratching the underside of floors where people sleep. Connor does not talk about his time as a ranger. His co-workers at the technology company know he used to work for the Forest Service, but he deflects questions about why he left. He tells them he wanted better pay and more stability. He does not tell them about crawling through a space barely 2 feet high and finding scratches that should not exist. He does not tell them about listening to something moving beneath him all night, walking back and forth and scraping. He does not tell them about the expression on Lucy's face when she saw something watching her between the floorboards. Sometimes he has nightmares about narrow spaces. He dreams that he is crawling through the darkness, too tightly confined to turn around. His face is inches from the earth, unable to move forward or backward. In those dreams, he always feels something behind him, something breathing on his ankles, something with fingers that scrape against wood. He wakes sweating and gasping, grateful for his apartment with concrete foundations and no crawl space. No dark hollow beneath where something could move unseen. The cabin no longer exists. The clearing where it stood is not marked on current maps and is already fading back into the forest. But the mountains remember. The ancient trees around that clearing know what moved beneath the cabin floor. They know what scratches the underside of human structures deep in the wilderness. They know what has eyes capable of looking through cracks and bodies capable of fitting into spaces that should be impossible. Lucy and Connor know it too. They carry that knowledge with them, like a weight that never grows lighter, no matter how much distance they put between themselves and that remote clearing. They know there are things in the Cascades wilderness that defy every rational explanation. Things that crawl where they should not fit. Things that watch from below with human eyes. Things that scrape messages into wood with appendages that might be claws or might be fingers. The Forest Service does not talk about why that cabin was demolished. The official records cite age and lack of use, but the rangers who work in remote areas, the ones who spend weeks alone maintaining distant trails and checking emergency shelters, tell stories around their campfires. Stories about cabins where the floorboards creak under a weight that should not be there. About scratching sounds that come from sealed spaces. About eyes that look through cracks from a darkness that should be empty. And when new rangers are assigned to inspect remote cabins, the veterans sometimes pull them aside first. They tell them to trust their instincts. They tell them that if something feels wrong, if the sounds do not make sense, if eyes appear where there should be no eyes, it is better to leave the work unfinished and walk away. Some places in the mountains do not want human presence. Some structures are built on ground where the boundaries between the possible and the impossible become dangerously thin. Lucy and Connor learned that lesson. They learned it by looking at scratches in the wood and eyes in the darkness. They learned it by walking 40 miles through the night because staying was unthinkable. They learned it in a way that changed them forever. A way that divided their lives into a before and an after. Before seeing what was beneath the cabin floor. After knowing what watches from the crawl spaces of the world. The mountains do not care what people believe or understand. Nature keeps its secrets. And beneath the forest floor in spaces too low to contain bodies, but somehow occupied anyway, something is still waiting. Something that scratches. Something that watches. Something that knows when people sleep above it, separated from it by only a few inches of wood. Something patient, persistent, and impossible. Something the Cascades have contained since long before humans walked those mountains. Something that will remain there long after the last cabin rots, falls, and returns to the earth. Story 6. Issa worked as a forest surveyor, spending entire days alone among the trees, marking specimens designated for logging operations. She had grown up in the foothills of the Cascades, the daughter of a logger and a forest ranger, and she knew the woods with the same intimacy most people know their own neighborhood. The work suited her perfectly. She preferred trees to people, solitude to crowds, and the straightforward logic of measuring diameter at breast height and evaluating timber quality. Weather was the only real danger that usually concerned her. Storms could bring trees down without warning. Lightning could strike during exposed work on ridges, and heavy snow could trap a surveyor miles from any shelter. But Isa knew how to read the sky. She knew how to recognize the signs of changing weather, and knew when to pull back before conditions became deadly. She had been doing that work for 6 years without any serious incidents. That record ended on a gray afternoon in February when the fog descended faster than she had ever seen in her life. Isa was working in a mixed forest of Douglas firs and western hemlocks, marking trees in a track scheduled for selective logging the following spring. The morning had been cloudy but stable. There were no weather alerts and no signs that any system was approaching. By the early afternoon, she had already marked 24 trees and was moving steadily through her survey grid. Then she noticed that the light was changing. The gray, diffuse clarity of the day began to dim rapidly, taking on a strange quality that made her check her watch. It was barely 2 in the afternoon. There were still hours of daylight left, but the forest was growing dark as if sunset were arriving. The fog appeared from the west, moving between the trees like something alive. Within 5 minutes, visibility went from hundreds of yards to less than 50 feet. In 10 minutes, Isa could barely see 20 feet in any direction. It was a dense white fog, thicker than any natural fog she had ever experienced. It moved against the wind, swirling in patterns that defied meteorology. Isa marked her current position on the GPS and began heading back toward her truck, carefully following the coordinates. She had been in fog before. She had navigated low visibility conditions dozens of times. This should not have been difficult. But this fog seemed to have presence. It did not only obstruct sight. It pressed against her like something physical, something with weight and intention. The temperature dropped sharply. Her breath formed clouds that mixed with the whiteness around her. The sounds of the forest seemed muffled and distorted. Her footsteps sounded too loud, echoing in a strange way. Everything felt wrong in a way she could not explain with words. Then Isa saw movement in the fog. Human-sized silhouettes were walking parallel to her route, matching her pace among the trees. She stopped. The silhouettes stopped too. Isa called out, asking if someone was there, if anyone needed help. There was no answer. Only those shapes at the edge of visibility, barely distinguishable from the fog itself, but definitely present, definitely watching her. Isa began walking faster. The silhouettes matched her speed. Now she could see 3 of them more clearly, moving among the trees to her right. Then she noticed more to her left. At least 4 figures, perhaps more. All of them maintained the same distance from her. All of them moved when she moved and stopped when she stopped. They never came too close, but they never fell behind either. They followed her with precision, as if they were attached to her by invisible threads. Her GPS indicated that she was moving in the correct direction toward the truck. She was half a mile away. She could cover that distance in 10 minutes, even in fog. But the figures continued following her, and Isa's unease began turning into real fear. There was something predatory in the way they moved, something deliberate in their maintaining exactly that distance. They were guiding her, she realized. They were keeping her moving in a specific direction. Isa abruptly changed course, turning 90 degrees to the left, away from the truck, to test her theory. The figures on that side moved to block her path. Now she could see them a little better. They were tall, wrapped in fog, never solid enough to make out details, but clearly there. She turned to the right. The figures on that side converged slightly, narrowing her path. They were channeling her. Whatever those things were, they were directing her movements. Then she heard the voices. Her mother's voice calling her name. But her mother lived in Portland, 200 miles away. The voice came from ahead, lost in the fog, clear and familiar. "Isa, sweetheart, come here. I need to show you something." Then she heard her brother's voice from another direction. "Isa, this way. You have to see this." Then the voice of a childhood friend who had died in a car accident 7 years earlier. "Isa, I've been looking for you. Come find me." The voices overlapped, echoing impossibly through the fog, calling her from different points. All of them were familiar. All of them belonged to people she knew or had known, and all of them were wrong. The tone was right. The intonation was right. But beneath it all, there was something fundamentally incorrect, like recordings played by something that did not understand human emotion, something that imitated sounds without understanding their meaning. Isa stopped trusting the GPS. She ran forward, no longer caring about direction or coordinates. She only needed to move to escape the shapes, the voices, and the fog pressing against her like water. Branches tore at her face. She tripped over roots she could not see. The fog grew even thicker, shifting from white to gray, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. The voices followed her, always a little ahead, always calling her name, always promising to show her something wonderful if she would only move a little farther. The figures surrounded her now, dozens of them, moving through the fog on every side. Isa could hear them, even if she could not see them clearly. The displacement of air as they slipped between the trees, the whisper of something that might have been fabric or might have been something else entirely. Her hand struck metal. Isa gasped and clung to it. It was the handle of her truck door, solid and real beneath her fingers. She yanked it open and threw herself inside, slamming the door and locking it immediately. She started the engine with trembling hands, not caring whether it was safe to drive. She only needed to move. She needed to get away from the fog and whatever it contained. The fog pressed against the windows, thick as cream, completely destroying visibility. Isa put the truck in gear and accelerated blindly down the logging road, trusting her memory and instinct to keep the wheels on the track. She heard impacts against the truck, soft thuds that made the vehicle shudder. She did not slow down. She sped up. 3 miles later, she burst out of the fog bank into the clear afternoon light. The transition was instant, like passing through a wall. 1 second, she was surrounded by impenetrable whiteness. The next, she was beneath a blue sky, with bright light and clear visibility for miles. Isa pulled over to the side of the road and sat there, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. After several minutes, she got out to inspect the truck. The entire vehicle was covered in handprints, small handprints, children's handprints, hundreds of them, spread across the hood, the doors, and the windows. But the prints were on the inside of the glass, not the outside. Small fingers had pressed against the glass from inside the cab, leaving marks and condensation that should not have existed. Isa stared at those prints, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were showing her. She had been alone in the truck, completely alone. And yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had been inside the vehicle with her, something small enough to leave prints the size of a child's hands, something that had pressed against the windows from the inside while she drove blindly through the fog. She called her supervisor and reported a dangerous weather situation in the study area. She did not mention the figures, or the voices, or the handprints. She said the fog had created unsafe working conditions and that she was returning to base. Her supervisor approved the decision without asking questions. Fog was a legitimate safety concern. Isa never returned to that study area. She turned in the incomplete data and requested reassignment to another tract. Her supervisor noticed that her hands were shaking when she submitted the report, but he did not comment. Forest surveyors frequently face dangerous conditions. Bears, falling trees, cliff edges hidden by brush. It was understood that sometimes you had to withdraw from a work site. 3 weeks later, another surveyor was assigned to complete the survey Isa had abandoned. He reported normal conditions, clear weather, no fog, and no difficulties. He completed the work in 2 days without any incident. His report mentioned nothing unusual. Isa now works in other areas, staying closer to main roads, avoiding the deepest sections of forest where fog can appear without warning. She checks weather forecasts obsessively before going into the field and refuses any assignment on days when fog is predicted. Her co-workers believe she has developed an anxiety disorder, an occupational hazard for people who work alone in isolated places for long periods. They know nothing about the voices, or the figures, or the handprints. Sometimes Issa drives past the turnoff to that logging road. She never takes it, but she looks toward the forest, toward the dark trees pressed close to the road. And she wonders whether the fog is still there, deep in the woods. Whether the figures still wait among the trees. Whether the voices still call names in familiar tones, drawing people into a whiteness that moves with purpose and intention. She wonders about the handprints, the children's hands pressing from the inside. She wonders whose children they were, if they were ever children at all, or if something inside that fog simply chose that form because humans respond to the appearance of children, because we are programmed to protect what seems small and vulnerable, because a child's voice asking for help is almost impossible to ignore. The Cascades hold many dangers, cliffs and crevasses, weather capable of killing, animals capable of maiming. But the most dangerous things in those mountains are the ones that cannot be explained, the ones that hide inside fog banks and call with voices you recognize, the ones that press their hands against glass from the wrong side and leave evidence that should not exist. Issa now knows those dangers. She carries that knowledge like a weight and will never again enter deep fog, no matter how much money she is offered, no matter how routine the assignment seems, because she knows what waits in the whiteness. She has heard it call her by name. She has seen its shapes moving at the edge of perception. She has felt its presence pushing her like pressure underwater. And she has seen proof of its impossible nature printed in condensation on the inside of her truck windows. There are kinds of knowledge that cannot be unlearned. There are experiences that change a person forever. Issa changed that February afternoon. She is now more careful, more fearful, more aware that the forest contains things that should not exist, but do. And when fog descends through the valleys of the Cascades, when it moves against the wind and turns in unnatural patterns, Issa stays indoors. She keeps herself safe. She stays away from the trees where the shapes walk, where the voices call, and where small hands press against barriers that should keep them outside, but somehow never do. Story 7. Henry and Amelia were celebrating their 5th anniversary with a 4-day backpacking trip through the Central Cascades. They were experienced hikers who had completed dozens of backcountry trips together. They were comfortable facing the challenges of wilderness travel and confident in their ability to handle any conditions they might encounter. That trip was meant to be a celebration, a return to the activity that had brought them together when they met on a group hike 5 years earlier. They had chosen a popular trail that would take them through subalpine meadows and past several crystal-clear mountain lakes. Everything was carefully planned. They had permits, proper gear, detailed maps, and a solid itinerary. For the first 2 days, everything went perfectly. The weather was ideal for late summer. Warm days, cool nights, and clear skies that turned the alpine lakes into mirrors reflecting the surrounding peaks. They crossed paths with other hikers on the trail, exchanged friendly greetings at designated campsites, and fell into the comfortable rhythm of traveling through the mountain backcountry. They reached their second night campsite near a subalpine lake surrounded by mountain hemlocks. The water was so clear they could see fish moving in the depths. While they prepared dinner on their camp stove, Amelia noticed a man standing at the opposite end of the lake, perhaps 200 meters away. He stood completely still, looking in their direction. He was too far away to make out clearly in the fading light of dusk. He was only a silhouette against the trees. Amelia pointed him out to Henry. They both watched him for a moment, waiting to see whether the man would move or say something. He did nothing. He only stood there still. Henry raised his hand in a friendly greeting toward what he assumed was another backpacker. The man did not respond. He did not wave back. He did not move at all. After a few minutes, Henry and Amelia returned to preparing their meal, though every now and then they looked toward the figure. When they checked again 10 minutes later, he was gone. They discussed it briefly. He was probably another hiker looking for a place to camp, who had decided the lake was already too occupied with them there and had left to find a more private site. There was nothing strange about that. Backcountry etiquette encouraged camping groups to spread out in order to preserve the feeling of a wilderness experience. They finished dinner, hung their food in a bear bag, and settled into the tent for the night. The lake remained quiet except for the occasional splash of a jumping fish and the whisper of wind through the hemlocks. The next morning dawned clear and beautiful. They packed up camp efficiently, following a system they had perfected over years of hiking together. The trail climbed sharply away from the lake, switchbacking up a ridge that promised spectacular views of the nearby mountains. About an hour after they began hiking, Amelia stopped abruptly. She pointed ahead and to the right, off the trail, on a rocky outcrop. The man was there, standing on the rocks, watching them, completely motionless. Henry could see him more clearly now in the daylight. He was tall and dressed in dark clothing, though still too far away to distinguish his facial features or specific details. Something about that absolute stillness made Henry uncomfortable. Even someone resting would shift their weight from one foot to the other, adjust their pack, or make some small movement. That figure remained as still as a statue. Henry shouted to him, asking whether he was okay, whether he needed help. There was no response. The figure only remained there, watching them. They continued hiking. Neither of them mentioned the man out loud, but both kept looking back. 20 minutes later, Amelia glanced over her shoulder and gasped. The man was now on the trail behind them, perhaps 100 meters away, following them. He still did not move in a normal way. He simply appeared in different places, always facing them, always watching. Henry turned to look. The trail behind them was empty. He told Amelia she had probably been mistaken, but she insisted she had seen him clearly. For the rest of the day, Amelia kept seeing the figure. Sometimes he appeared on ridgelines above them, sometimes among the trees beside the trail, sometimes behind them. Always at a distance, always still, always watching. Henry never saw him when Amelia pointed, but then he would turn a few moments later and catch a glimpse of someone dressed in dark clothing at the edge of visibility. Only a brief sight before the figure was hidden by the terrain or the trees. By afternoon, both of them were deeply unsettled. The appearances had become too frequent to dismiss. Someone was following them, staying far enough away to avoid direct confrontation, but present enough that they could not ignore him. They talked about leaving earlier than planned, cutting the trip short and returning to the trailhead that same afternoon. But they were already 10 miles into the backcountry. Hiking back would take at least 8 hours, which meant traveling well into the night. The safest option was to reach the planned campsite for the third night, get up early the next day, and cover the final stretch back to the car. The campsite for the third night was at a designated site near the trail, with an established tent platform and a metal box for storing food away from bears. When they arrived, another group was already there, a couple in their 60s who greeted Henry and Amelia warmly. The presence of other people felt reassuring. They set up their tent, stored their food properly, and joined the older couple by the fire to talk. They did not mention the figure that had followed them all day. It sounded too paranoid, too irrational. But when darkness settled over the campsite, Amelia saw him again. He was at the edge of the firelight, standing among the trees, watching. She grabbed Henry's arm and pointed. This time Henry saw him too. The figure was clearly visible, outlined against the lighter darkness of the open forest. Tall, dressed in dark clothing or wrapped in shadow, completely still. The older couple turned to look where they were pointing. The woman asked what they were seeing. They could not see anyone. Henry stood up and grabbed his flashlight, directing the beam toward the place where the figure stood. The light illuminated trees and low vegetation. There was no person there, but Henry had seen him. Amelia had seen him. Both of them were certain. The older couple exchanged concerned glances. They suggested that sometimes after a long day of hiking, the mind could play tricks, that shadows could look like people, that exhaustion could cause confusion. Henry and Amelia did not argue. They thanked them for the company and retreated to their tent. Neither of them slept well. They lay awake listening to the sounds of the night, the rustle of small animals, the distant call of an owl, the murmur of the wind. Amelia dozed restlessly, waking again and again with the feeling that someone was standing outside the tent. Henry stared at the fabric ceiling, following every sound and trying to convince himself that stress and fatigue were creating problems where none existed. At 3 a.m, Henry woke from a light sleep and saw the figure standing at the entrance of the tent. Not outside. Inside. The silhouette stood completely still, outlined by the moonlight filtering through the nylon. A tall shape facing him, standing only inches from where he lay. Henry could not see any features, only darkness in the shape of a man. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He lunged forward, reaching out his hands to grab, push, or defend himself. His hands passed through empty air. The figure had vanished. The tent was empty except for him and Amelia, who was sleeping beside him. Henry sat there, gasping, his heart pounding hard, certain of what he had seen but unable to reconcile it with the empty tent around him. He woke Amelia and told her what had happened. She believed him. She had felt something too. A presence, a weight in the air that should not have been there. They agreed immediately. They would leave at that very moment, even though it was still night. They did not care about the danger of hiking in the dark. They needed to get out of those mountains. They packed by the light of their headlamps, moving carefully so they would not wake the older couple. They left a note thanking them for their hospitality and explaining that they had an emergency that required them to leave early. By 4 a.m, they were on the trail, moving as fast as they dared in the darkness. They reached the trailhead as the sun was beginning to rise. Exhausted and frightened, but safe, they drove back to Seattle in silence. Both of them were processing what they had experienced. Both of them were trying to find rational explanations that did not appear. They told themselves it was over. A strange, disturbing experience, but finished. Now they were home, safe in their apartment, inside a city of nearly 4 million people. The wilderness had been left behind. Whatever they had seen, or thought they had seen, was 60 miles away, in the mountains. They unpacked their gear, showered, and tried to return to normal life. That night, Amelia woke at 3 a.m. and saw the figure standing in the doorway of their bedroom. The same dark silhouette, the same impossible stillness, watching her from across the room. Amelia screamed. Henry woke and turned on the light. The doorway was empty. There was nothing. But Amelia had seen it as clearly as she had ever seen anything in her life. The figure from the mountains was in their home. The following night, Henry saw it in the bathroom mirror. The silhouette was behind him while he brushed his teeth. He turned around suddenly. There was nothing, but it had been in the reflection, clear and undeniable. For 2 weeks, every night, one of them saw the figure in doorways, windows or reflections, always watching, never moving, never coming closer, but never disappearing either. They tried to ignore it. They tried to convince themselves it was psychological, some form of shared trauma response. But objects in the apartment began to move. Keys that should have been on the table appeared on the counter. Doors they had closed were open. A framed photograph of the two of them during their 2nd anniversary fell from the wall and shattered, despite having been securely hung. The apartment no longer felt safe. A friend suggested they visit someone who understood those matters, someone from the local native community who knew the old stories about the mountains. Amelia was skeptical, but desperate. They found a woman through a friend of a friend, an elderly woman who listened to their story without interrupting. When they finished, she nodded as if she had heard similar stories before. She told them something had followed them, something that did not want to let them go, something that had marked them in the mountains and claimed them as its own, something that existed in the spaces between the world of the living and whatever comes after. The woman performed a cleansing ritual in their apartment. She burned cedar and sage, sang in a language Henry and Amelia did not understand, and placed small bundles of herbs and stones in the corners of each room. She told them the entity would leave, but the mark would remain. They would always be more visible to that kind of thing than ordinary people. They had been touched by something from the mountains, and that contact could never be completely erased. The apparition stopped after the ritual. The figure no longer stood in doorways or appeared in mirrors. The apartment felt lighter, less oppressive. Henry and Amelia wanted to believe everything was over, but both of them knew something had changed. Now they saw things at the edge of their vision. Shadows that moved wrong, shapes that should not have been there, but appeared for only an instant. They had become sensitive to a layer of reality most people never perceive. They did not go backpacking again. They canceled their permits for future trips. They sold their camping gear. The mountains that had brought them together, the same ones they had loved for years, now felt dangerous in ways they could not explain to friends who asked why they had stopped hiking. They said they were busy with work, that they had become interested in other hobbies. They did not talk about the figure that had followed them home from the Cascades. 6 months later, they moved to a new apartment. Neither of them admitted it out loud, but both hoped the distance would help. The new place somehow felt cleaner, less haunted. But Amelia still sometimes saw shadows standing at the edges of rooms. Henry still felt presences in door frames late at night. The mark remained just as the elderly woman had told them. Sometimes Amelia wondered whether they should have stayed in the mountains, whether the figure had been trying to keep them there, whether leaving had somehow broken an unspoken agreement. She wondered whether other hikers had seen the same silhouette, whether other people had been followed home from those trails, whether anyone had stayed, surrendering to whatever claimed them in the subalpine meadows and beside the crystalline lakes. She never told Henry those thoughts. But late at night, when the shadows moved in ways shadows should not move, she wondered. And in the deepest part of herself, in the place that had been marked by something ancient, patient, and relentless, she knew the figure was still watching, still waiting, still claiming something it had marked as its own in those mountains where reality grows thin and old things walk freely. The Cascades had not let them go. Not really. They had simply carried the presence home with them, bringing it down from the mountains like a memory impossible to discard. A reminder that some places claim those who visit them, and some things follow you.